I don't know about you, but I am not much of an artist. And yet, there is a draw event in GameMaker that we are going to discuss and learn how to use. If you're ready, let's learn some game dev. We left off in the Spike Manager and we got our game looking and working fairly well. The next thing we're going to add is a score into our game. So to do that, the first thing we're going to do is bring in a score box, so someplace that we can have to visualize and see the score. And then we're going to learn how to actually draw text inside of that. So I'm going to make a new sprite, right click, create sprite. This one I'm going to call SPR Scorebox. Click on import. And what we're looking for is going to be under assets, sprites, GUI, and it's going to be under blank boxes. And I'm going to choose this medium box. Now you can choose whichever one you want. You don't even have to have a sprite necessarily, but it does help. So I'm going to choose this larger medium box. I see now there's a medium long. We want just medium box. So here this is. And we want the origin here to be right about the middle center, although I have found that the origin on this does tend, if we bring it down a little bit, sometimes it looks a little bit nicer, because where we're actually going to draw text at starts at this origin. So that's kind of important. If you don't like where the text is at, you can change it with code, or you can just change the origin of your sprite to be right about, maybe closer to the little left, down a little bit. Doesn't matter too much as long as you're right around there. And now we need to make a new object. So we're going to create object. This one's going to be called obj scorebox. And we're going to give it that sprite we just made. And the only event we need in the scorebox is going to be a draw event. So I'm going to add that. And when we go to draw, there's a lot of options. You've got draw, GUI, draw begin, draw end, so on and so forth. There's a bunch here. We just want the very first one that only says draw. And this is where we're going to draw our game score. So there's a lot to know and a lot of functions that go along with drawing text. But the first and most important thing is, after you add a draw event to an object, that object will no longer draw itself in the game. So let me show you what I mean. Let's go to our room and drag in, go to instances and drag in our score box. We're going to bring it down here. Now, this doesn't quite work because obviously the ground is above it. So we can put it in the barrier one if we wanted to, or we could make an entirely new instance layer. And depending on what you want to do, that's totally fine. You can have as many layers in your game as you want. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and make a new one. I'll call this one score. So we'll bring in our score box, and I'm going to resize it just a little bit so that it fits a little more comfortably here. So when I hold shift, I can scale this down proportionally, which means that every time it goes down, it will also come in one, so it will maintain its rectangular shape. So after I do that, I can bring it over here. If I double click on this, you can actually see that it now has a scale X of a very long number, but essentially 0.65 and 0.65 is what it's been scaled down to. Now, inside of our room, when we move things around, they are snapped to a grid, and you've seen this before. To take that off, we come up and we click on this toggle grid button, and the grid disappears, and it also gets rid of the snap. And now there's another kind of snapping inside of the room to the boundaries of the room itself, which is what I want, because I want this to be in the bottom right corner. I'm going to turn the grid snap back on. If you ever want to change the grid snap settings, you can come in here and change the color, the opacity. You can also turn the snapping off right here and leave the grid visible. It's just easier if you just click that button, in my opinion. So that's what I did. But now our score is in the bottom right corner. So it's there, it should show up, but if we go into our game, you will see that it is not actually visible. It's gone. No matter what we do, it doesn't exist there. So that's not ideal. So the reason is once you add in this draw event, GameMaker's like, oh, you want to be the artist? Go for it. But I'm going to completely bow out and I'm not even going to draw your own sprite for you. And this is fine. Because GameMaker has a very quick and easy function called draw underscore self. You just call this one function, and you don't need any arguments, don't have to do anything else. You call it, and then it draws itself. The name is pretty self-explanatory. There you go. Now our score box is in the game just like we want. Now, depending on how you want to stack your sprites, so if you wanted to have a sprite behind the actual object sprite itself, you would call that here. So any sprites drawn before draw self appear behind it. And I need a slash there. So if I wanted to have another sprite, let's say, we haven't really talked about this much, but if I wanted to draw a sprite, I could draw a sprite like, let's see, SPR barrier, subimage of 0, and let's draw it right on RX and RY. Now, this might not show up because the barrier is actually kind of small, so let's actually draw a spike instead. Let's do SPR large spikes. So if I draw this, the large spikes will be behind the score, just like that. And if I draw that, if I cut and paste that down here, if I call that code after draw self, then they are in front of it. So draw self is great, and you need it once you add a draw event, but you got to remember where to put it, because if you want anything to go behind it, like if you want a frame for your sprite or your object, or you're going to be doing multiple sprite stackings, like you want to draw a sprite, but you want the player to be able to choose between different colors, this is one way to do it, to just draw, 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 draw on top of one another. The order is very important here. So the first thing you need is draw self almost always, because you want that sprite. But if you want something behind it, it does come before it. So keep that in mind. Okay, we have that. Now what we need to tackle is actually the score itself. So right now we don't have a score variable. We don't have any way we're keeping track of the score. GameMaker has a built-in variable called score. But, it looks like I just have to download the manual again because I just updated. But we don't want to use this built-in variable. It even tells you that you should not use this in new projects. It's an old, just legacy way of keeping a score. And the big reason you don't want to use it is because every object in your game uses the same score. So if I set the score equal to 5 here, but let's say I have another object I'm keeping a score in, you can't, because every single object will be set to a score of 5. And then if you change any score, it also changes. So that means we need to have our own score object. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our player object. We're going to go to the create event. I'm going to press F12 to maximize our screen real estate here. And what we're going to do is create a global variable. Now, global variables are kind of like these instance variables. We have to create them, we give them a name, and then we can access them. The difference being, global variables can be used in any object, referenced anywhere very easily, and it's always the same one. So remember that an instance variable like this is unique to this object. So if I had a y speed in my obj dead cyclops, which actually we do, yeah, we do. So that one can have its own y speed, and it has nothing to do with the y speed in obj cyclops. Totally independent. Global variables are linked. They're all the same one. And when I say that, I don't mean every global variable is the same one. What I mean is when we say this, global dot my score equals 0, anytime you say global dot my score, it's going to reference this variable right here. So we can have one global variable with a unique name, and you can have as many as you want, but you can access them anywhere with just the prefix global and a period. So as long as it's been created once, you can access it. So we're making it here. I'm going to put a note. So score for the game. And after that's been created, we can go into our score box, And now we can access it and draw our score right here. So this is how you draw text. It's one function. There are lots of different functions, but the main one is draw underscore text. And you can see there's a ton of different ones here, but we're not going to touch on those right now. We just want the first and most basic. Let's take a look at the manual and read it. So we've got draw text, and we have X, Y, and that's the X coordinate and the Y coordinate. That should be becoming kind of familiar whenever you see X and Y. And then the string. Now, a string is a set of characters, usually like a sentence, but a string can be any length. It can be one character. It could be the entire dictionary. A string is just, well, it's a set of characters grouped together, all inside of these quotation marks. So you can see GameMaker turns yellow when you use a string like this, whereas other times, if you use a number, I think it actually turns like pink or red. So it distinguishes it. It is different, and we've used strings before, but this one wants one. Now, it does have a note up here, which we're going to talk about, is the position is determined by draw set H-align and V-align, or I guess it's influenced by it. And we're going to talk about those functions in just a second, but for right now, I'm just going to say X and Y, because I want this text to be drawn on the X and Y of our sprite. So remember, the origin of our sprite is right here. So X and Y, it will start drawing text right there. So we'll go in here. So X and Y is where it's at. And the string starts with quotations if we wanted it to be a string. Now, we don't, so this is kind of confusing, but essentially, it just needs something to draw. It converts it to a string in the end, but we can pass in our global variable called global.myScore. So even though my score is a number, GameMaker will take that number, convert it to a string, and draw it without any qualms. So if we run this right now, we should see a 0 inside of that score box, and it's super tiny, but it's there. It's a little white 0, but you can see it's actually not centered properly, which we're going to fix, and it's also really hard to read. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the added functionality that you can put whenever you're drawing text inside of GameMaker, because there's quite a few options that you've got. The first one we're going to change is the font. So you saw that the font was really small. So if we want to change the size or the style of the text, we need to change the font. All of these functions that we want to use for changing things start with draw and set. And then if you just do that, you can look at all of the options you've got. Everything here except for the circle precision and the lighting and this SWF AA level, these are all ones that have to do with drawing text. So if we want to set the font, we say draw set font. Now we don't have any fonts in our game, so let's go make one. So over here, there's a font group. I'm going to right click and create a font. I prefix this with FNT for font, and we'll call this score. And it's important because we might have multiple fonts in our game. We might have one for the score, for the menu, and for anything else that we might want to draw in here. So we can change the font itself. You can download and install custom fonts if you want. I think I might have one on here that's kind of interesting, but I'm not even sure. Yeah, I've got Mana Space. This is kind of a fun looking pixel retro art text style. I kind of like this. So we'll use Mana Space. You can use whichever one you want. If you want a new font, you can go online, download it, install it, restart GameMaker sometimes it picks it up automatically, and then you can just start using it. So the style you can choose between like italic, bold, underline, stuff like that. And then you've got the size. So the size here is default of 12. 12 is not a huge font. By default, or by minimum amount, you want it to be 18. And even then, 18 can be pretty hard to read in games. So I'm going to bump this font up quite a bit more. We're going to put this at 36. And we're going to give that a try. So in our score box, we need to call the font we just created. So I say font score. And now all of the text I draw in my game, after calling this, will use this same font. So let's run the game. And now it should be significantly larger and a little bit easier to read. Excellent. So I think that white is still kind of hard to read, so we're going to change the color next. To do that, we call draw, set, color. Now what's cool in GameMaker is you can actually use RGB values. You can use, I think it's HSV, hue, saturation value. You can pass in a hex value if you know what that is. And you can just choose one of the default ones. That's what we're going to do right now because I'm trying to keep this super basic. I'm just going to say C underscore, so it's color C, and they have all of these colors that you can choose from right here. I'm going to go with black, and we run our game now. The text drawn will now be black. A little bit easier to read. You can fit it to a different color if you want. Doesn't really matter to me, but that's how you change the color. Next up is the alignment. So in the game, you're seeing that the text is not really where the origin is at. We've told it to be right here, pretty much in the middle, but it's down here, even going into the green border of our sprite, which is no good at all. So instead of changing it through code, what we need to do is change the H align and the V align. So I'm going to say draw, set, H align. And what's really great is the manual description here. So this has a description of exactly what it does with some pictures here, which is great. There are 3 values you can put in here, which is FA left, center, and right. And I'm pretty sure these just equate to 0, 1, and 2, but they have a constant name to make it easier to read and understand. So by default, it is FA left, which means that when we draw text, it actually starts on the very left of the alignment. Sometimes this makes sense. For a long text box, you'd actually want to start it on the left and then have it go all the way to the end, and then you can calculate where that end is, and then it wraps back around. So for a long dialogue box or something like that, it makes total sense. For our score, which is just one object, and we want to actually draw the text directly slam bam in the middle, this doesn't work. So instead, we're going to do FA center. So for H align, I'm going to say FA center. Then that's horizontal alignment. We also need to do the V align, which stands for vertical alignment. And same thing, we'll bring up the manual and it shows us what this means. So the default value is FA top. So when we call any text without changing anything, it is default to the left and default to the top. And that's what's going on with our text, is it looks kind of like this. It's not where we would expect it to be. So we can change it from top to middle or bottom. And what we want is going to be middle. So I'm going to change this to FA underscore middle. And now when we call this, we'll actually get our text in the center like we would expect it to be. And there we go, right about where we want it. So that's awesome. It's working just like we would expect. Now, here's something to note. These settings will carry over for every text drawn in your game, which means that if we draw text anywhere else in our game, these settings will be those settings. If you want that to change, it means that you have to set each of these every single time you want to draw text. It can be really obnoxious, it can get really annoying, but it's just kind of how it is. You could also come down and after this and do a reset if you wanted to. So you could set the font back to default, you could set the color back to white. So you could reset it all and that might be okay. But in my experience, the default settings are useless and I've never used them before. And so you might as well just get used to setting it every single time you call it. What's really nice is you can come in and you can just make a custom function. So you can make something yourself that's just set text, and then you can just pass in a score, a color, and the H line, V line all in one function to make it a lot faster. And I'll teach you how to do that later on down the road. But for right now, this is just to let you know, If you ever use draw text or any of the draw texts, you've got to set these settings every single time you do that. So we'll come into that once we actually make a menu and add another level into our game. The last thing we're going to do in this video is get our score working. So let's go to obj Cyclops, because right now we have a variable for our score, but we aren't doing anything with it. It's a constant 0, which isn't much of a score. So instead we're going to go into our step event, and in the step event we're going to increase the score. We're going to say global.myScore plus equals, and the way I'm going to do this is 1 divided by 60. What this does is it's going to be 1 point for every second they survive. Because the game, it runs at 60 frames a second, so this is going to be 1 divided by 60, and so when a whole second passes, it will have added all the way up to 1, otherwise it's going to add in fractions of 1. So if we run this, we can actually see this kind of increasing. So essentially this is more of a timer than a score. There are different ways you could do this. You could increase the score based on every single spike you pass. You could have this increase based on, well, really anything you want. I'm doing it based on time, and I think that looks pretty good. But if you don't want the score to increase with those points in there, you just want to see it 1, 2, 3, what you can do is you can come down to the score box, and when we draw this text, right now it's drawing the number exactly as you would expect. But we could go in and we could say we want to use the function round. So this number comes in at 0.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, and it's going to round it to the nearest whole number. And so if we run this game right now, it's going to only be whole numbers, and it will increase like this. So you don't get the precision that you would, but you also don't have the numbers ticking up all the time. It kind of just depends on your preference. I like seeing those numbers tick up. I like having that precision inside of there, but that's just me. You can do whatever you want. I'm showing you the ways that you can do that. So that's everything for how to draw text in your game. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, then just let me know. Drawing text and overriding your object's draw event can be confusing at first, especially if you forget to add that draw self function. Don't forget about that. Remember to set all of the settings every time you want to draw text anywhere in your game, and you should be totally fine. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. And, as always, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.